If you're a beginner and you want to TIG weld sheet metal, this is the meat and potatoes of this. This is what you need to know. You got to know all of it. Today we've got a video on beginner TIG welding, everything you need to know to get started and to do the things we do in this shop that involve TIG welding. First thing I want to go over is the practical application of TIG welding when you're building projects like we do on Make It Custom. Where are you going to use it? What are the advantages? And is there still a place for MIG welding? Yes, there is. We'll get to that later. But let's have a look at some of our projects and where we've used TIG welding. So on something that you don't want a lot of spatter, you don't want to have to do a lot of cleanup, you want a small weld, that's something that TIG welding is very, very useful for. Let's take, for example, welding exhaust pipe. If you're going to MIG weld that, it's definitely going to be a large weld, and they're not going to be the prettiest, right? So on exhaust, like Elio's done on this 1930 Model A Roadster, welds are exposed. You're going to use TIG welding. They're nice and small. The thickness of material is thin, so you can really control and be precise with your heat and deposit small amounts of filler to make up the weld. Whereas with MIG welding, you don't get to control the amount of filler. So you're going to be depositing whatever wire feed rate you've set on the machine. That's how much filler per second is going to be going down. Whereas TIG welding, you can just dab a little as you go, and you can adjust your temperature with your foot, if you're using a foot pedal, as you go. With TIG welding, you can be so precise with your heat and where you're pointing it, where you're pointing your arc, that you can kind of lean most of the heat onto the thicker piece of metal and therefore weld things that are thick to thin quite easily. Now, sheet metal is another thing that you would want to weld with TIG, typically if you're going to hammer it, right? If we're going to weld and then shrink, because if you watch the channel, when you weld anything, you're shrinking it. The heat expands, but it pushes the warm material into the cold material, and when it cools off, it actually ends up tightening back up and shrinking. So hammering your welds after you've finished welding will stretch them back out, creating a nice even panel again. So if you're going to be doing that with MIG, it's not really possible. You're going to just deposit so much material that you're going to have tons of material to grind off. It's going to happen so quickly that the hot and cold kind of makes it brittle and the extra material deposited. So you're just not going to enjoy hammering out your weld if you're MIG welding. So a TIG weld can be nice, small, precise, tight fit, and is still soft enough that it can be hammered. Whenever we're TIG welding sheet metal, it is your best case scenario. It's closest to gas welding. And it is very similar in the fact that you're controlling the amount of filler and you're controlling the amount of heat. Where gas welding, you're bringing a flame closer and further away, but you're still depositing filler material with a rod. Whereas TIG welding, you are just having your tungsten arc be what makes your puddle and controlling your amperage with your foot, so your heat with your foot.